Hello, all participants and attendees. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and evening, wherever you may be. My name is Justin Reash, and I am the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us this Sunday, and I am pleased to be hosting a panel discussion on the new book, Winston Churchill's Illnesses. Now, if you haven't bought it yet, this is what it looks like. I'm actually going to add it to our chat, where you can purchase it. So please do support the authors and purchase the book if you can. So before I introduce our guests, I would like to remind you of three things. First, this panel discussion is being recorded and will be free to watch later on in the coming days. You'll be notified of when the discussion is available. Second, we will be taking questions from the audience in the last 15 minutes of the panel. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to submit your questions. And I already pitched the book. That was my last point. So I think what I'll do now is introduce our panelists. And I'm going to begin with Allister Vale, who is one of the authors of the book. Allister is a consultant clinical pharmacologist and toxicologist at City Hospital in Birmingham, the UK, and is an honorary professor of the University of Birmingham. Thanks for joining us, Allister. And John Scadding is an honorary consultant neurologist emeritus at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, and chair of the UK's government's independent medical expert group. Good evening, and thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you very much, Justin.
I'm also very pleased to be joined, we all are very pleased to be joined by an incredible mother-daughter duo. Gail Rosseau is a clinical professor of neurosurgery at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Hi, Gail.
Hi, Justin. Delighted to be here.
And with her as well, and all of us, is her daughter, Natalie Rosseau, who was also at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences as a fourth-year medical student. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so to begin, we're going to focus on the book, and Allister and John have provided a PowerPoint, which will last about 10 minutes, and it details the book and their research. So please enjoy.
The title of our presentation is borrowed from Martin Gilbert's excellent book, In Search of Churchill, which describes his decades-long quest to write the definitive biography. Although much has already been written about Churchill's health, little has been published that is evidence-based. In order to write the definitive account, by providing a description and analysis of Churchill's major illnesses, we required access to all of his medical notes. Against a background of a lifelong interest in Churchill, I will now describe our search to identify these sources of medical information. Step one was to identify all the doctors and nurses who had treated Churchill. Lord Moran's book, The Struggle for Survival, was used as a starting point. However, it soon became apparent that many of the clinicians who treated Churchill were either not mentioned or given little prominence by him. Step two was far more difficult. This involved multiple attempts to find the families of the doctors and nurses concerned, in the hope that they still had case notes in their possession relating to Churchill. Step three involved approaching archivists at royal colleges and the Wellcome Library with both general and specific requests. When found, we discovered the clinical notes were often closed for perusal, and most certainly for publication. We were fortunate to have the support of the Churchill family in having these closed archives open for our use. In the end, all known archives were open to us and publication was allowed. Thus, we based our description of Churchill's illnesses on a large number of new sources. Churchill's parents, Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill, were able to engage doctors of reputation and skill, often at considerable cost. Later, following Churchill's military career and his establishment as a major figure in British political life, any doctor invited to see him did so without question. We are not aware of any doctor declining to see Churchill. Almost all did not charge a fee. Many of the doctors involved in Churchill's care kept detailed clinical records. A few also included comments about Churchill's reaction to his illnesses. We have included these comments in our book because they help provide a rich picture of Churchill, his fears, frustration at being ill, his insights, his request for detailed medical information, his supreme intelligence, and his enduring wit. But above all, Churchill's reaction to serious illness demonstrated his courage, resilience, sense of duty, and determination to continue serving in high office. This is best shown by his ability to continue during many stroke episodes. We believe this to be truly remarkable, which is why the subtitle of our book is Courage, Resilience, Determination. The care that Churchill received from more than 30 eminent physicians and surgeons, and from the carefully chosen nursing staff, was exemplary. The contributions of 3 of these clinicians who treated Churchill in Carthage in December 1943 will now be described. But first, let me remind you of the details of Churchill's illness. On the 11th of December, he flew to Carthage to review military operations in Italy. On arrival, Churchill wrote, "I'm completely at the end of my tether, and I cannot go on to the front until I have recovered my strength." Churchill had developed a fever that in the end lasted for 6 days due to left lower lobe pneumonia. This infection was complicated by 2 episodes of irregular heartbeat, atrial fibrillation. Lord Moran had become Churchill's principal physician in May 1940 and remained in this role until Churchill's death in January 1965. Moran devoted himself to Churchill's care, travelling with him during the war and on most of his subsequent foreign travels, and was virtually always available at short notice for consultation when Churchill was in Britain. Moran, already a senior and distinguished physician in 1940, could call on any opinion he felt necessary, to Churchill's great advantage. Moran decided to publish his book, The Struggle for Survival, in 1966, shortly after Churchill's death. The book was published in the face of Lady Churchill's objection, though Moran claimed to have received Churchill's permission to write his book. Later editions of Moran's book clarify that it was not based on an actual diary as such, but rather notes jotted down at the time, interspersed with non-contemporaneous essay material, which understandably has led to misleading impressions. Although Jamie Wilson, the present Lord Moran, generously gave us complete access to the closed archive at the Wellcome Library, including multiple versions of Struggle for Survival, we have drawn on all other available resources in writing about Churchill's illnesses. The Moran archives contain, among other documents, Churchill's temperature and flu charts from this illness. You will note that Churchill was so ill that it was 5 days before he could add a whisky and soda to his fluid regimen. Key clinical information regarding the treatment Churchill received in Carthage is also provided by the unpublished autobiography written by Professor Pulvertaft. At the time, Pulvertaft was Assistant Director of Pathology, Middle East Forces, based in Cairo. In addition to standard laboratory work, Pulvertaft also played a crucial role in producing penicillin in the Middle East and conducting trials on its use. Here is part of Pulvertaft's autobiography which describes his arrival in Carthage. Between 1939 and 1945, Bedford served with the Royal Army Medical Corps as a brigadier in North Africa. At Pulvertaft's suggestion, he was summoned from Cairo by Morin to treat Churchill in December 1943. He also treated Churchill in 1962 after he had suffered a fractured hip. Here is the first page of Bedford's typed-up medical notes relating to this illness. In writing our book, we adopted a rigorous, evidence-based approach throughout. We accessed all existing published sources and identified a wide range of new sources. These were amalgamated with the contemporaneous documented observations of Churchill's family, friends, and other political leaders. We very much hope you enjoy the book as much as we did in writing it. More information is available on the book's website. Gail Rosseau has written a detailed review of our book in the next issue of Finest Hour. We encourage you to read it. A full list of acknowledgements relating to the sources and images used in this presentation may be found in our book. All are copyrighted and may not be used without the permission of the copyright holder.
Well, thank you all for enjoying that slideshow. And thank you, Allister and John, for putting it together. If I can ask, John, I know you wanted to speak on add a short follow-up to this PowerPoint with a short discussion on the strokes, which he had numerous of.
Thank you very much, Justin. Yes, very briefly to say that between August 1949, when Churchill was 74, and his death in January 1965, he had 7 strokes and 2 transient cerebral ischemic attacks. 3 of these strokes affected the left side of the brain, 3 the right side of the brain. 1 stroke affected his balance, and it's a question of some debate as to the exact localization of that stroke. He also had a disturbance of vision, which was transient and almost certainly due to cerebral ischemia, lack of blood supply to the head. And he then had a transient ischemia attack affecting the left cerebral hemisphere with loss of speech. And for the reasons that we've argued in detail in the book, we feel it very likely that these are due to small vessel disease, in other words, disease of the small arteries in the brain. Of course, at that time, when Churchill was suffering all these episodes, there was no detailed imaging that we take for granted now. No CT scanning, certainly no magnetic resonance imaging scanning, MRI, and even carotid ultrasound examinations were a thing of the future. And so and likewise, the treatment of stroke was largely expectant. There were no specific treatments for stroke. And Lord Brain was closely involved in the majority of these episodes. Russell Brain, who was the most eminent neurologist in the UK at the time. At any rate, we could talk perhaps later about the medical neurological details, but I think it's worth noting that, of course, these episodes led to questions about his ability to govern. He was prime minister for much of this time. And perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion of resilience a little bit later on. However, I would just say at this point that following an acute left-sided weakness, a left hemiparesis, in June 1953, he chaired a meeting of the cabinet within 24 hours of that episode, and no one noticed. So this is a demonstration of extreme resilience.
Wow, that's incredible. I think your point is well taken regarding the types of treatment, the type of diagnostic tools that we all take for granted now, were either non-existent or in their infancy. And to your point, the ability of this man who had numerous ailments, as detailed in your book, from, of course, my favorite, as I said earlier, of getting hit by a car to all of these strokes, to be able to still govern. And we'll certainly come back to that. I'd like to ask Gail, I would like to get Gail and Natalie's opinion on the book. Gail, let's start with you. With you did write a review in Finest Hour, but please share your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Justin. And I want to say thank you to Allister and John for writing this book. It is just a point of fact that many people, even casual observers of history and Anglo-American relations, think they know about Churchill's health, right? People think they know about his depression, his alcoholism. There's just a lot that is not scientific in the literature, and we're so grateful to the two of you for taking a scientist's point of view and method of working and using an evidence-based route to history to bring us real facts. But so thank you for that Herculean work that you did. I had really two takeaways from this wonderful book. One is just to be amazed at how much medicine has progressed, even since the middle part of the last century. I mean, the pace is enormous and really fast. And then the second is his own humanity and kindness and resilience in the face of personal rather than political trouble. So just a couple examples of that in terms of his of how medicine has progressed. Let's look at some of the things that doctors Vale and Scadding discovered or uncovered. So you mentioned, Justin, that as the son of a wealthy family, Churchill all his life, even before he was politically prominent, had access to the best medical care. Yet when he had pneumonia at age 11, the best care at that time was oral and rectal brandy. How crazy is that? It just, I mean, it's amazing to me. Or things like when he had something as simple as an inguinal hernia, which was for him, for this famous person, treated through an 8-inch incision. And now, of course, it's done laparoscopically and people go home the same day. The mortality rate for pneumonia for someone who is in their 60s, as he was during World War II, was 40%. 40%. And we forget that the leader of the House of Commons at the time, Edward Fitzroy, contracted pneumonia at the same time as Churchill and actually died of it. So his life was really in danger on multiple occasions, and yet he was resilient and even humorous. And that leads to the second great takeaway is his enormous humanity, wit, and courage through all of this.
Wonderful. And excuse me, Natalie, first off, I know we all thank you for joining us. As someone who is studying medicine now, who's part of a younger generation, what was your response to the book, and what did you take away from it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think some of my takeaways were similar. It's amazing to see how much medicine has evolved and the way in which the standards for, the um, standard of care is really different, from not so long ago. And I'm going into general surgery, and so I was particularly interested in, his operative experiences that he had, and those would be handled very differently today compared to when he was under the knife then. But I think for me, I really found a lot very interesting about this book, not only because I'm a medical student, but also because I was a history major in college. And I've always felt that there is so much to be learned from interdisciplinary study. And so I always feel like I learn more about history if I understand it through the lens of science, and I understand science better if I apply the humanities. And so I think this is a really amazing example of that, where this interdisciplinary collaboration helps us better understand the past, but also I think gives us insights about the modern day and also the future of science and of medicine, and what legacy Churchill continues to have on us today.
I echo your comments about doctors Vale and Scadding producing a book that is obviously based in fact. It includes, of course, detailed medical records and medical jargon, but it not only is it readable, but it provides many glimpses of this man who, as you know, there are multiple books written about him every single year. This one stands out for its uniqueness, and it provides another side to him, but also the people who assisted him, who took care of him, provides a different side of that to them as well. Excuse me. So I completely agree with you. If I can ask Allister to take himself off mute, and I would love to know from your point of view, Dr. Vale, throughout your research, what surprised you? In the amount of extensive research, and Dr. Scadding, you can also answer that as well.
I think when we started out on the journey to find the records, we never thought we'd be so successful. I think John will recall the excitement when I informed him with each success or each family having been found who allowed us permission to reproduce the case notes. But I think the biggest surprise was at the College of Physicians, because the archivist was unaware at the time of two of the sets of case notes, and it was only following a flood that they were rediscovered, which was very fortunate from our point of view.
I would like to add that I owe a great deal as co-author with Allister to his terrier-like adherence to the task, and his ability to get access, to find what was where, and also to charm many people into agreeing to release these records so that we could examine them. And as Allister has just said, the records at the Royal College of Physicians were quite remarkable. The handwritten and typewritten notes of Lord Brain, in my own specialty of neurology, were extremely revealing.
If I may ask, and Gail and Natalie, please feel free to follow up if whenever you have a question. And I should say, we've already had over 12 questions submitted by attendees. Thank you very much. We'll certainly get to those a little later, but please continue to send them. From my own point of view, I was curious as to why you included chapters on potential alcoholism and also the famous black dog, which has dogged, no pun intended, Churchill for decades. Why did you add those two, if they're not acute situations of illness?
I think the chat line indicates, Justin, why it was necessary, because most of the questions so far are about alcohol and about depression. So the relevance, I think, is there. And moreover, John and I have taken a different view from that which commonly pertains in both cases. And in the case of the black dog, we have gone into this very extensively and shown that actually he didn't suffer from that condition.
if he had, if I may just add, if he had suffered from major depression, there's no question in my mind that he would never have been able to govern and continue in high office as he did. Churchill was cyclothymic, as we all are to an extent. He was well known for his emotionality and his tearfulness, and sometimes quite publicly. He had much to be emotional about, is what I would suggest. And I think it was perfectly normal. And indeed, part of what drove him on was his passion to do the right thing. And that's indeed part of his extraordinary resilience, which we may come to in a moment. So that deals with the depression. As for the alcohol, of course, there were times when his alcohol intake was prodigious, one could say, but it was occasional, and for the most part, he could make a little bit of alcohol last a long time. And his private secretary, Jane Portal, later Lady Williams, told Allister and me about a year ago at the Royal Society of Medicine, where we gave a presentation, that in the morning he would have what he called his mouthwash, which was a large tumbler with a tiny measure of whiskey and the rest of water, and he would make that last a very long time.
I'm so glad you brought up resilience, and there's actually just a question in the chat about COVID-19 and what type of time we're living in. I would love to have, Natalie, your point of view. Being a student now, not only a student but a medical student, which I've never been, but I would presume can be quite stressful and difficult at times. With this past year of studying from home, working from home, what does resilience, the term resilience, mean to you? How has it manifested for you and your fellow students?
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful question. I think that's a topic that I'm encouraged to see the medical community talking more and more about. I'm, as you said before, a fourth year medical student. So I'm transitioning from being a medical student to being a medical resident at the end of this academic year. And it's been really wonderful in my residency interviews to have programs, and I'm applying for surgical programs, to hear that topic of wellness and resilience being one that is being discussed much more than I understand it was in the past. So I think that's a really positive thing. But I think this year has been exceptionally challenging for people around the world, but particularly the medical community. And I think as medical students, we have had to look for creative ways to supplement or support the work of our colleagues. I can speak really specifically only to my experience. And so by no means does my experience represent that of all medical students. But we received an email in mid-March from the deans of our medical school telling us that clinical rotations for medical students had been suspended indefinitely. And there was no real guidance, because there was no national guidance or understanding of how this would evolve. And I think I'm particularly proud of how students responded. My classmates were, I think, resiliency, embodied. Students banded together to search for creative ways to continue to recognize our position as learners in the medical community, but seek out creative solutions to still advocate for the health of our patients and connect them with resources. At GW in particular, myself and many of our classmates were involved in creating a community resource guide for the District of Columbia and surrounding Maryland and Virginia. Students were involved at COVID testing sites. Students also organized what they called DC COVID sitters. So it was providing childcare for healthcare professionals working on the front lines. That's just to name a handful of the responses that my own classmates had, and I know students around the country were involved in similar efforts. And so I think it was really, while it was a challenging moment for the country and for us as students in the medical community, it was a real moment, I think, of grounding ourselves in why we wanted to become doctors in the first place, and how so much of what we do is to serve our patients better and to really ground ourselves in the social determinants of health and acting as real physician advocates for our patients. And I think GW in particular does an exceptional job of grounding us in clinical public health and having that be part of our credo of do no harm. And part of that is not just serving patients in the clinic, but it's also reaching them in the communities and doing what you can. And so I think that was a really important teachable moment for me. And I was so inspired by my classmates and to see students taking that responsibility very seriously.
Well, if I can just jump in, what
Please.
Natalie said about resilience, I think speaks very much to the individual and brings us to what this book does for Churchill and Churchill's reputation. You know, he's widely acknowledged to be one of the most important figures of the 20th century, world-class statesman by anyone's estimation. But what this book does that the many, many other books about Churchill don't do is that it shows those great qualities that Winston Churchill had that can be an inspiration to us in our daily lives. You know, none of us really think too much about, well, what would we have done if we were planning D-Day, or how would we have handled the Tehran conference? But, you know, the things that he went through with his own personal health, getting hit by a car by doing what many Brits would do in New York, as he did, or we could do in London, is look the wrong way, and he's hit by a car. And yet within days, he's grateful for the experience, wants to share it and write about it. He's in battle at the Battle of Omdurman, right? And one of the great last great cavalry charge, 1898. And he's grateful for the fact that he has this terrible health problem of a recurrent dominant shoulder dislocation, which meant that he was armed with a pistol and not a sword, and says, yes, it's been a problem my entire life. He's a politician who has trouble shaking hands, right? But yet it probably saved his life. So over and over again, we see his personal reaction to a personal health challenge as being one of courage, grace, and grit.
What?
May I
Go ahead, John, please.
May I comment? Natalie, your comments take me back 50 years to when I was a medical student. And I think that the resilience, I don't know of a medical student whose resilience was not at some stage tested. And it seems to me that resilience depends upon motivation, a sense of purpose, a vision for what one's doing, confidence and determination. And a feeling that what you want to do is right. It's the right thing for you. It's the right thing for society. And also, of course, the ability to take some hard knocks and recover from them. But absolutely behind all this is the need for support. And not only for your ideas and those material things, but some emotional support. And I think one can't rate that highly enough. And that emotional support comes from family and close friends. Churchill showed resilience in abundance during World War II and later on. One thinks of immediately at the time of Dunkirk and his vision for what was right, his decision to send the small ships to bring back our troops against all the odds. And at that time, his most effective weapon was, of course, the English language. He knew how to use it. And I think indeed one of his colleagues who was not in favor of what he was doing said, Churchill has learned how to weaponize the English language. So there are various ways of looking at resilience, but I would suggest that you've got to see it in the round like that. And my dear late father, who was involved in Churchill's care, I think himself, as we all do, showed some resilience. He used to refer to it as patient endurance.
That's incredible. And Natalie, I will say, very inspirational to hear what you and your fellow classmates have done this past year and directly impacting the community that you live and work and study in Washington. So, you know, very well done. And thank you for sharing. There's quite a few questions. I wanted to ask Allister and John, And Gail, you touched on this, the Battle of Omdurman. One person asks, this is Brendan Rosseau. I don't know if there's any relation, but potentially there is. But it's a great question from this for Allister and John. Your research, did it reveal anything new about the skin graft that Churchill famously gave to a fellow soldier? Can you tell those who do not know where the skin was taken from? Can you tell the quick story, and did your research show anything new?
Well, there are those, Justin, who doubted that he'd actually given us a skin graft, but we were fortunate in finding a letter from the recipient who here in the palace, who wrote to Churchill many years later to thank him for having done so. And then the episode is recorded in the Moran Struggles for Survival book, when he explains that he gave part of himself in this way. So I think that is the crucial new detail of finding this letter.
I would simply add that the most remarkable thing, and we've got two surgeons, a surgeon and a budding surgeon here, is that clearly the technique used for the skin graft was aseptic, and neither of them suffered infective complications.
And this is a great anecdote to exemplify how far we've come very quickly in medicine. I mean, imagine taking skin from one soldier who wasn't injured and putting it directly on to the body of another soldier. It just wouldn't happen now. I was just this week talking with the dean of the GW College of School of Engineering, and we were talking about their project that is doing 3D printing of human tissue, including skin, for skin grafting, so that you would be able to create it, grow it by computer, and use it in that way. I mean, it's amazing. And Churchill, who was interested in everything, a real polymath, would be fascinated to know that that's the direction we're going in now, and that he wouldn't have to just roll up his sleeve and donate skin. So it's fascinating.
I think HLA, of course, was a thing of the future, but it also demonstrated Churchill's commitment to a fellow soldier, somebody he didn't know particularly well. He said, no hesitation. Yes, of course, take some skin, do it.
It may be worthwhile adding, John, that the surgeon had in mind the nurse who was with him, but she looked very pale at the prospect of donating the skin. So Winston did so.
Right.
Wow, that's incredible. There's a few questions here. Man named Jay, man named David, talk about mental health. And I would like to ask, and I would love everyone's thought on this, but mental health, of course, is now studied quite extensively. Modern day, it's a big thing for students, for young people, and also for people going on through their career and stresses of a career. The question I have, and this is kind of a combination of two, is how did Churchill's mental health impact his resilience? And then there specifically, Jay asked about the relationship with his parents was aloof and removed and cold, especially with his father. Is it anyone's point of view that prepared him to have a stronger, mental health capability? Any thoughts on this discussion, this topic?
I think his upbringing was typical of the time. It's much more difficult to know whether it had an impact. Of course, many writers have suggested that because it was so apparently cold, that this did impact him, but we haven't found the evidence really to support that.
I would agree with that. I would support that and say that, of course, he was a man of his time, and relationships, particularly between fathers and sons, were very different in those times. How many fathers then hugged their sons, for example? And so there was an emotional distance. And I think Churchill was always independent. He was a bit of a dreamer. he didn't do terribly well at school. He took a little while to get into military training, and this story is all told in the book. He was saving it up for later.
Yeah, I think that it is important to think about how these challenges to his mental health really fine-tuned his resilience. I give a talk to the medical students called Churchill and the Art of Resilience, and we use his art. And he famously was a painter of some renown, and of course, much more so now that he's had this brilliant career as a statesman and has passed on. But he was able to channel anxiety of his work life into things that were productive, such as painting, such as writing. I mean, it's not the topic of this book, but of course, Churchill published more than Shakespeare and Dickens combined and won a Nobel Prize in literature. So in addition to doing things like planning the National Health Service and D-Day and so forth, he did have creative outlets. So he had very productive ways of dealing with the anxiety and stress of his job. And that's one of the things that we can all take away from this book. Again, I think the great gift of this book is that there are examples from his personal life and health that we can more easily incorporate into our own lives than battle plans and national strategies. But it shows how much this singular life really has to teach all of us, even today.
Natalie, I wanted to, sorry, I just want to go ahead, John.
I was going to just add, and he had the most amazing wife.
Yes, absolutely.
Completely agree. Natalie, I want to give you a chance to respond if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all really interesting points. I think something that's been really powerful in my medical education has been the way in which we've learned that mental health and mental illness are things that are much more pervasive than was previously understood. And while it continues to be quite a stigmatized area of health and medicine and can be really difficult from the patient experience, I think this conversation is very interesting because applying our understanding of mental health and those kinds of psychiatric diagnoses, I think does give us a better understanding of this individual. But I'm not sure that it, at least for me personally, whether he had a clinical diagnosis or not, I think it makes him a valuable lesson in leadership, because there were these ups and downs in his mental health. I think it feels relatable and very real. And so I think that for me was the main takeaway with regards to his that conversation.
Well, it's important to note, and like you said, maybe at that time there was not able to diagnose any sort of mental illness. But let's go back to John's or Dr. Scadding's original point initially in the beginning of this conversation, discussing how could one govern throughout all of these significant illnesses and acute health crises. I mean, the man led a country in World War II, similar to Franklin Roosevelt, who was well documented, had significant health issues, and subsequently died before the World War was over. John and Allister, what are your thoughts on how did he persevere in be able to govern at these very stressful times?
Absolutely. I think, of course, during the Second World War, this was well before Churchill's cerebrovascular disease first became evident. I mean, his first stroke was in 1949, so some years after the war. Of course, he showed enormous resilience in relation to a number of other illnesses, not least the episode of pneumonia in Carthage, which Allister has described in his presentation. Later on, of course, there were considerable doubts about his ability to govern. And I'll just describe, if I may, the immediate aftermath of a transient cerebral ischemic attack in 1952, in which he lost the ability to speak. So a left hemisphere transient ischemic attack. And people sort of went behind his back in a way. And Lord Moran, his physician, was in discussion with John Colville, the joint principal private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, who was private secretary to the Queen, and Lord Salisbury, who was Lord President of the Council. And Lascelles said, well, listening to what you have told me, I would say at once that the Prime Minister ought to resign and be content to be the elder statesman in the Commons or the Lords. Better perhaps in the Lords. I have been expecting for some time to see you in this room. It is true that sometimes the Prime Minister is all on the spot. And then I say to myself, why am I worrying? But at other times, he doesn't seem able to see the point of a discussion. Well, Churchill and Lord Moran had a discussion a day or two afterwards, and Churchill said to Moran, well, I knew something had happened when I could not get my words on the telephone. I don't like it. I was frightened. Oh, not frightened of anything, but I'm all right now. Why? You couldn't tell me by examining me that anything had happened. Moran says to Churchill, but the fact remains that you've had notice to go slower. To which Churchill replies, I don't mind dying in harness. And then a few days later, Gilbert, Churchill's biographer, wrote in 1988, reflecting on this, on February 26, the powers of recuperation and the extraordinary determination of this man of 77 were made abundantly clear to those who had known of his arterial spasm and discussed how to send him to the Lords. For it was only 5 days after the attack that Churchill spoke in the House of Commons on foreign affairs. So this was Churchill's ability. He had what I like to call, and sorry about this, Gail, it's not a very neurological term, cerebral reserve. He had so much there, he could afford to lose bits and pieces. He would bounce back because of his resilience, and by golly, could he perform.
You are absolutely right, and a great example of his mental health and physical health coming together with his humor. It relates to one of my favorite general surgery aspects of his life. In 1922, he had surgery for a black gangrenous appendix through a 5-inch incision, which now, of course, might be treated with antibiotics or a laparoscopic procedure. And he was running for re-election. He couldn't campaign. His wife did an admirable job, but you know how it turned out. And his response, his final word on that was, in the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. And just how joyful he is. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, that's part of why we all look to him for. It's the big stature and doing the big grand things. It's the little things that he does with great grace, and courage, but he can even be funny. And that's what makes every generation just want to embrace him. It's that humor that shines through, and that's courage and resilience.
And Gail, I'll say personally, one of the first times I was exposed to Churchill was I had appendicitis in college and it was removed. And someone one of my history professors sent me a quote. You know, I emailed them, hey, I'm not going to be there. And he sent me that quote. And it was just so, you're right. Like you connect on this personal level and you're like, wow, a man who is so, you know, written about for so long I can actually connect in this very indirect, not meaningless, but very small way. Mm-hmm. Well, if I may, there's quite a few individual questions here that I'd like to ask everyone, and I'm kind of going to go a little quickly on these because I would like to respond. And I have to say, this has been a very well engaging group. So thank you, everyone who is watching. Thank you for sending your questions, and we really appreciate it. So I'm going to ask the first one to the authors. Um, was there any research or archives that you wanted to have, that you requested to view, that was denied to you?
Not in the end, but once or twice I had to call Randolph Churchill in to help. And after a message from him, the archives were open in about 30 seconds.
That's funny. Speaking of the ability, the cerebral reserve, I really love that term. And I am not, again, as stated, not a neurosurgeon, so I'm going to go with it, and I'm going to use that as moving forward. Was there any sort of history, and maybe Gail, you can speak to this if you've done your own research on Churchill's neurological history. Was there any research done on predisposition for neurological issues for Churchill or his family members?
Well, yes. I mean, one has to look at the Churchill himself as an individual, and of course interpret this in the light of now understood risk factors to do with cerebrovascular disease, and I've listed them somewhere here. For a start, his age, he was 74 at the time of his first stroke. He was somewhat overweight, and you may have missed it on Allister's slide, or actually you didn't show this one this time, Allister. Sir John Parkinson, who saw him in 1942, remarked, plump, but not as heavy as expected. Okay, so Churchill was somewhat overweight. He was a cigar smoker, but never, as far as we know, a cigarette smoker. His alcohol consumption was steady, let's put it like that. But he didn't have alcohol misuse disorder, as we've argued. He had a very rich diet indeed. He had little regular exercise, although in later life he enjoyed swimming in the Mediterranean while he went on holiday. He worked excessively long hours and many late nights. There was probably some inappropriate drug use, barbiturates and amphetamine, and Allister may want to comment on that. He had a borderline high blood pressure, what would be regarded now as borderline high, and there were also episodes of recorded atrial fibrillation, but they were always brief. And actually, I think I saw a question flash up. I don't think the atrial fibrillation was in any way related to his strokes. I think they were due to vascular disease in situ. As for the question of work-life balance, which is a term that has been introduced in my lifetime, I don't think Churchill will have understood what that meant.
Very good.
But I don't think his wife would have either. The entire family was involved in this glowworm and his moving through life and through the world, and they all supported it. And he was just an example of greatness being thrust upon someone and rising to the occasion. He lived through an amazing time and had an amazing response to it.
Well, if I can ask Natalie, how would you go about, if I may, encouraging other students, your peers, to really engage with Churchill, his legacy, about his resilience, if you've not already done so?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, for me, I find a lot of joy in the study of history. And I think both in terms of finding really excellent examples of leadership and resilience, but also in lessons of, examples I'd like to not emulate in my own life. And I think there's a lot to be learned from those two models of character and leadership. So I think students are always looking for examples of successful people in the past and lessons to be learned and applied in their own lives. And I think Churchill is a really interesting example of so many of those things in, of course, politics, but also in medicine and art. There's just so many disciplines that he touched. And so I think he's would be of great appeal to people who are interested in a lot of those disciplines and for so many of the reasons that we've discussed today.
Wonderful. And so my last question, and I'd love the practitioners to answer this, current practitioners. Churchill was famous, and I saw Mark Bainbridge chat this question. So Churchill was famous for both his daily naps as much as possible, but also taking a hot bath as much as possible every day, including in the trenches when he was on the front line in World War I. Do you think that for his longevity and the ability to recover and the resilience, were daily naps, is that a good thing for did that positively affect his ability to persevere?
Well, there's some very recent evidence, of course, on which we've just been hearing about recently, currently about siestas and the advantages of a nap of up to 40 minutes a day after lunch. And of course, in some parts of particularly in the Mediterranean, this is de rigueur. And I mean, it's something I've always resisted, but maybe I should take it up.
I think you
Certainly
should.
we know that we should be, we have learned that we should be treating sleep and adequate amounts of sleep, whether it's in the form of naps or a satisfactory night's sleep. It really is important to health. And although he kept very late hours, he also got up late and famously worked from his bed for many hours before he actually took the bath and got out of bed. And so I think he respected the need to recharge his battery. And for Churchill, it was sleep. It was also conversation with others. I mean, he really derived energy and mental health from family, friends, scientists, and advisors, and that was important to him. And he also said he couldn't live without champagne. I think we did touch on alcoholism, and I think we should give, my own conclusion is the same as Doctors Vale and Scadding, that he was not an alcoholic. And I think we should leave him with the final word on that, in which he says, I cannot live without champagne. In victory, I deserve it, and in defeat, I need it.
Well, I will say, I greatly appreciate all of your time. He was a leader and he was ahead of his time in many ways. In the tank, being the original anti-fascist, and then also being a man who took naps every day. So I think we've learned so much from him, and it still applies to this day. So thank you all. Thank you, doctors Vale, Scadding, and Rosseau, and soon to be Dr. Rosseau. We really appreciate your time, and please do buy the book, everyone.